My name is Ava Reynolds. And I didn't find out my parents made a decision about my money. Because they told me. I found out. Because I heard something I was never supposed to hear. At first, I thought I misunderstood it. But then I heard my name again. And one sentence that made everything stop. We'll tell her when it's already done. And in that moment, I realized something wasn't right. So instead of confronting them, I stayed quiet. Because if they thought I didn't know, they wouldn't stop talking. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you I trusted my parents completely. Not in a dramatic way, just the kind of trust that builds over time when nothing ever seems wrong. We weren't one of those families that fought a lot. There were no loud arguments, no obvious problems. Everything felt stable. My dad worked long hours, mostly dealing with finances and investments, and my mom handled everything else, appointments, schedules, anything that kept the house running smoothly. And me? I stayed out of it. That's how it had always been. Whenever anything related to money came up, my parents would handle it. College funds, savings, anything in my name, it was always framed like something they were taking care of for me. Don't worry about it, my mom would say. We've got it handled, my dad would add. And I believed them. Because why wouldn't I? I never had a reason not to. But looking back now, there were moments that didn't quite fit. Small ones. Easy to ignore. Like the time I asked about a statement that came in the mail, and my dad took it before I could really look at it. Or the way conversations would shift whenever I asked anything too specific, nothing obvious, just subtle changes, like they were guiding me away from something without making it seem intentional. At the time, I told myself it was normal. Parents handle things. Kids don't need to know everything. That's what I thought. And honestly, that's exactly what they needed me to think. Because when you trust someone completely, you don't notice when they start making decisions for you, without ever asking what you would have said. The first time something actually felt wrong wasn't when I heard that conversation. It was a few days before that. And at the time, I didn't even realize how important it was. I was filling out a simple application online, nothing serious, just something related to housing near campus. They needed basic financial details, something I had done before without thinking twice. So I logged into the account that was supposed to be under my name. And at first, everything looked normal. The layout, the balance, the usual information. But then I noticed something small. A transaction I didn't recognize. It wasn't a huge amount. Nothing that would immediately set off alarms. But it wasn't mine. I stared at it for a second, trying to remember if I had forgotten something. Maybe I had moved money around and didn't recall it. Maybe it was automatic. That's what I told myself. Because when something doesn't make sense, your first instinct isn't to assume the worst. It's to make it make sense. So I kept looking, scrolling through the history. And that's when it got worse. There wasn't just one transaction. There were several. Different dates. Different amounts. All of them subtle enough to go unnoticed. Unless you were actually looking for them. And I wasn't supposed to be looking. That's what it felt like. Like I had accidentally stepped into something that wasn't meant for me to see. I remember leaning back in my chair, just staring at the screen, trying to process it. Because now I had two choices. I could go downstairs, ask my parents directly, and get an answer right away. Or I could stay quiet and figure it out myself. And for a moment, I almost chose the easy option. I almost walked out of my room and asked, "Hey, what is this?" But something stopped me. Not fear. Just a feeling. The same kind of feeling you get when something is slightly off, but you can't prove it yet. Because if this was nothing, then asking wouldn't matter. But if this was something, then asking too early would only make it harder to understand the truth. So I closed the laptop, took a breath, and decided not to say anything. Because whatever was going on wasn't going to reveal itself in one moment. It was already happening. And the only way I was going to understand it was if I paid attention long enough to see the pattern. A few nights later, everything changed. Not because someone told me the truth, but because I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. It was late. Not that late, just late enough that the house had gone quiet. My mom was usually upstairs by then, and my dad stayed up a little longer, sometimes on calls, sometimes just going over things at the kitchen table. I had gone downstairs to grab water. Nothing unusual. No reason to think that night would be any different. But as I got closer to the kitchen, I heard voices. Low. Focused. The kind of tone people use when they don't want to be overheard. At first, I didn't stop. I wasn't trying to listen. But then I heard my name. And everything in me just paused. I didn't move forward. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there, just out of sight, and listened. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. Words like transfer, timing, authorization. And then my mom said something that made it impossible to ignore. She's going to ask questions if she sees it. There was a pause. And then my dad responded, calm, like this had already been decided. She won't. Not yet. Not yet. That phrase stuck with me immediately. Because it didn't sound like uncertainty. It sounded like a plan. Like something that had already been set in motion. And I was just not part of it. I remember my grip tightening on the glass in my hand. Not out of anger. Out of realization. Because suddenly, those transactions I had seen earlier didn't feel random anymore. They felt connected. Deliberate. Like pieces of something bigger that I hadn't fully seen yet. I should have walked in right then. I should have said something. Made it clear I knew what they were talking about. But I didn't. Because in that moment, I understood something that changed how I handled everything after that. If I walked in, the conversation would stop. They'd explain it away. Minimize it. Control what I heard next, and I would be left with answers that sounded right, but might not be true. So instead, I stayed exactly where I was. Quiet. Invisible. And I kept listening. And then came the sentence. The one that made everything else irrelevant. We'll tell her when everything is already done. That was it. No confusion. No misunderstanding. Just clarity. This wasn't something they were figuring out. This was something they had already decided. And whatever it was, it involved me. Without ever including me. I didn't stay any longer after that. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound, and went upstairs like nothing had happened. But nothing felt the same anymore. Because now, it wasn't just a feeling. It wasn't just a few strange transactions. It was real. And whatever they were planning was already in motion. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was panicking, but because my mind wouldn't stop putting pieces together. Everything I had seen, everything I had heard, it all started connecting in a way it hadn't before. And for the first time, I stopped thinking like a daughter and started thinking like someone on the outside looking in. Because when you're inside a situation, you make excuses. You tell yourself there's a reason. That there has to be an explanation that makes everything okay. But the moment you step back, you see it differently, clearer. And what I saw wasn't confusion anymore. It was intention. By the next morning, I had already made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. Because if what I heard was true, then they weren't guessing. They had a plan. Which meant they also had expectations about how I would react. And if I reacted the way they expected, I'd lose whatever advantage I had just gained. So instead, I did the one thing they would never see coming. I acted normal. Completely normal. I went downstairs like I always did. Sat at the table. Had breakfast. Listened to the same conversations. And neither of them said anything about the night before. Not a word. Which told me everything I needed to know. Because if it was nothing, they would have explained it. But they didn't. They just carried on. Like everything was exactly the way it had always been. And for the first time, I understood why. Because they believed I didn't know. And as long as they believed that, they would keep moving forward. Keep talking. Keep making decisions. Without realizing I was already paying attention. Over the next few days, I didn't try to force anything. I didn't go looking through their things. I didn't ask indirect questions. I just watched. Small details. The way my dad would step outside to take certain calls. The way my mom would lower her voice when certain topics came up. The way both of them avoided eye contact whenever anything even remotely related to money was mentioned. It wasn't obvious. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And slowly, a pattern started to form. This wasn't one decision. It wasn't something sudden. It had been building for a while. Planned. Carefully. And the more I watched, the more I realized something else. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't temporary. It was permanent. Which meant, if I waited too long, there wouldn't be anything left for me to protect. By the fourth day, watching wasn't enough anymore. Not because I was impatient, but because the pattern had become too clear to ignore. There was something happening, something structured, and whatever it was moving forward whether I understood it or not. So I did the one thing I had been avoiding. I went back to that account, the one I had checked earlier. But this time, I wasn't just looking for something that felt off. I was looking for confirmation. I logged in slowly, almost like I expected something to stop me. But nothing did. Everything looked the same as before. Clean. Organized. Normal, on the surface. But once I started digging deeper, it didn't take long. Because now I knew what I was looking for. I opened the transaction history again. Scrolled further back this time. Weeks, then months. And that's when I saw it clearly. This hadn't started recently. It had been happening for a while. Small transfers at first. Amounts that wouldn't raise attention. Then slightly larger ones. Still spaced out. Still subtle enough that if you weren't tracking them, you wouldn't notice anything wrong. But when you looked at it together, it wasn't random. It was controlled. Deliberate. Like someone was moving things, piece by piece. Making sure it never looked like too much at once. I remember just sitting there, staring at the screen, feeling that same quiet realization settle in again. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a process. And it had been going on without me even knowing it existed. I should have felt angry. Or at least shocked. But what I felt instead was focus. Because now I knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to tell me the truth. Not until it was too late to change anything. Which meant, if I wanted control over what happened next, I had to understand everything before they realized I was even looking. So I kept going. I checked linked accounts. Names attached to transactions. Authorization logs. And that's when I found something that changed everything again. A secondary account. Not fully hidden. But not obvious either. The kind of account you wouldn't notice unless you were specifically looking for connections. And it wasn't in my name. It was connected to my dad. But some of the transfers had come from my account. That's when it stopped being subtle. Because now, it wasn't just about money moving around. It was about control. Legal control. Ownership. And whatever they were planning. It wasn't just temporary access. It was something that would leave me with nothing to question. Because there wouldn't be anything left in my name to question. I leaned back, staring at the screen again. And for the first time since this started, I realized how close I had come to missing it completely. If I hadn't checked, if I hadn't listened, I would have walked straight into it. Signed whatever they put in front of me. And by the time I figured it out, there wouldn't have been anything I could do. But now, I had something they didn't expect. Time. And just enough information to make sure the next move was mine. Once I understood what they were doing, everything became simpler. Not easier. Just clearer. Because before that, I was trying to figure out why. Now I didn't need to. The why didn't matter anymore. What mattered was timing. How far they had already gone. And how much time I had left before whatever they were planning became irreversible. So instead of reacting, I started planning. Quietly. Carefully. The same way they had. The first thing I did was go back through everything again. Not just to confirm what I already knew, but to understand the structure. Where the money was moving, which accounts were connected, what required my authorization, and what didn't. Because if I was going to stop this, I couldn't guess. I had to be exact. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized something important. They were relying on one thing. Me. Not questioning anything. Not interfering. Just doing what I had always done. Trusting them. And that's what gave me an advantage. Because as long as they believed that hadn't changed, they wouldn't adjust their plan. Which meant I could move without them noticing. So I didn't rush. I didn't make any sudden changes. I didn't move money right away, because that would have been obvious. Instead, I waited, watched one more day, then another, just to be sure there wasn't something I was missing. And during that time, they kept acting normal, which confirmed everything. They had no idea. And that's exactly what I needed. Because the moment they realized I knew, everything would change. They'd lock things down, move faster, control the situation again. So I had to act before that happened. Not too early, not too late. Just at the exact moment it would matter most. And that moment came sooner than I expected. It happened when my dad mentioned something casually at dinner. He said we needed to review some documents later that week. Nothing serious. Just routine. At least, that's how he said it. But now I knew better. That wasn't routine. That was the final step. The part where everything they had been setting up would become official. Permanent. And once that happened, there wouldn't be anything left for me to stop. So that night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to wait anymore. Because if I did, I'd be too late. That night, I didn't hesitate. Not because I wasn't nervous, but because I knew hesitation would cost me everything. I waited until the house went quiet. Same routine. Same timing. My mom upstairs. My dad finishing whatever he was working on. Everything exactly the way it had been every night before. And that's what made it easier. Because nothing felt different to them. But to me, this was the moment everything changed. I went to my room, closed the door, and opened my laptop. No second guessing. No overthinking. Just focus. Because by that point, I had already gone through everything enough times to know exactly what I needed to do. This wasn't about reacting anymore. It was about precision. I logged into the account again. Moved slowly, carefully, making sure every step was right. Because this wasn't something I could fix later if I made a mistake. This had to work the first time. I started with the main account. The one everything was tied to. The one they assumed I wouldn't touch. And I began transferring everything. Not randomly. Not all at once. But in a way that made sense legally. Structured. Clean. Irreversible. Every dollar that was supposed to be mine moved into a place they couldn't access. A structure they couldn't undo. Something I had only learned about because of the way my dad had explained things growing up, without realizing I was actually paying attention, and the entire time. My hands stayed steady. Because this wasn't panic. This was control. I double-checked everything. Every account. Every connection. Made sure there were no loose ends. No way for anything to be pulled back without my approval. And when I finally leaned back, it was done. Completely done. Nothing left in the place they expected it to be. Nothing left for them to move. Nothing left for them to control. I sat there for a second, just letting that sink in. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Just clarity. Because for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting to their plan anymore. I had replaced it. And the part that mattered most? They still had no idea. To them, everything was exactly where they left it. Everything was still moving forward, just the way they expected. Which meant the next part was going to hit them all at once. Without warning. Without time to adjust. Exactly the way they had planned it for me. The next morning, nothing looked different at first. Same kitchen. Same routine. Same quiet start to the day. My mom was already there, making coffee. My dad walked in a few minutes later, holding his phone like he always did, half focused on whatever he had been checking. And for a moment, it felt like everything was still normal. But then, something changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't immediate. It was subtle. The kind of shift you only notice if you're looking for it. My dad stopped mid-step. Just stopped. He looked at his phone again. Then again. Like he was trying to make sense of something that didn't line up. My mom noticed it too. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, which was already unusual, because he always had an answer, even when he didn't. But this time, he didn't. He just kept staring at the screen, scrolling, refreshing, like he expected something to fix itself if he looked at it long enough. And then he said it, quiet, almost to himself. "What is this?" That's when my mom stood up, walked over, looked at his phone, and I watched her expression change the same way as had. Not confusion, not shock, recognition. Like they both knew exactly what they were supposed to be seeing, and exactly what was missing. For a second, neither of them said anything. And that silence said more than anything they could have explained. Because now, it wasn't just a plan anymore. It was a plan that had already failed. My dad looked up at me then, directly, and I could tell immediately. He knew. Not everything, but enough to understand that something had changed, and that I was no longer where he expected me to be. "Did you log into the account?" he asked. Simple question. But this time, it wasn't casual. It wasn't routine. It was controlled. Measured. Like he was trying to keep the situation from slipping any further. And I could have lied. I could have played it off. Pretended I didn't know what he was talking about. But I didn't. Because at that point, there was no reason to. So I just looked at him and said, "Yes." And that's when everything shifted completely. Not because I raised my voice. Not because I explained anything. But because now, they understood something they hadn't before. I wasn't guessing anymore. And whatever they had planned was no longer in their control. For a moment after I said it, no one spoke. Not because they didn't have something to say, but because there was nothing left to control. My dad didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just sat there, like he was recalculating everything in his head. Every step, every assumption, trying to find the point where things stopped going the way he planned. My mom tried to speak first. Not aggressively, just carefully. Like if she chose the right words, she could still fix it. "Ava, we were going to explain everything," she said. Going to. Not we did. Not we tried. Going to. And that was enough for me. Because it confirmed what I already knew. This was never about including me. It was about timing. About making sure I only knew what they needed me to know. At the exact moment they needed my agreement. I didn't argue with them. I didn't raise my voice. Because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a result. And results don't change because of explanations. "I know," I said. And for the first time, they didn't respond. Because there wasn't anything left to explain. They both knew what had happened. Not just that I had seen it, but that I had understood it. And more importantly, that I had already acted on it. Everything they had been building. All the quiet decisions, the timing, the control. It was gone. Not destroyed. Just no longer theirs. And that's the part they hadn't expected. Because they didn't think I would question anything. They didn't think I would look closely enough to see it. And they definitely didn't think I would do something before they were ready. After that, things got quiet again. Not tense. Not chaotic. Just different. Because once you see something clearly, you can't go back to not seeing it. And once trust shifts like that, it doesn't go back to what it was before. I didn't move out that day. I didn't cut them off. But something changed. The way I looked at them. The way I listened. And the way I understood what trust actually meant. Because trust isn't about what someone says to you. It's about what they do when they think you're not paying attention. And if there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that control doesn't disappear. It just moves. And the moment you stop assuming everything is being handled for you is the moment you realize you should have been paying attention all along. So tell me, if you were in my position, would you have trusted them? Or done exactly what I did? Subscribe,